So CivilNet is in Dilijan for the Armenian Society of Fellows conference, and it is my pleasure to be joined now by Anoush Fraser Terjanian, the founding director of the US Social Science Research Council's Anxieties of Democracy program. Moreover, she was appointed by the Cabinet and the Governor General, the King's representative in Canada, to serve on the Governing Council of Canada's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. How was that? Was that a good introduction?
Yes, sure.
Perfect.
Great.
So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so
Ms.
much.
Fraser Terjanian. I want to first off ask about this Anxieties of Democracy program. Two words shot at my eyes, anxiety and democracy, which is very interesting in the context of Armenia, because many would describe Armenia as a country that is democratizing, that is transitioning, is in a transitional phase, but there is a lot of anxiety at the moment in Armenia due to several factors, and it's interesting that in this period of anxiety, there's also this period of democratization. How do you feel about that dichotomy between the two in the Armenian context? Do you have any observations that you could share with us?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you again for doing this work and for sharing the work of our meeting here today. It's a very important meeting because key to a robust and resilient democracy is active participation of the higher education sector of research. And what I would say is that when the Anxieties of Democracy program was created in the United States, we started in 2014. It's important to note that this is a paradigm that preceded us in the United States and that exists around the world. And so democracies are complicated subjects, and they don't come fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus. They are works in progress. And since I have been in Armenia, I have had the opportunity to have discussions with a wide range of Armenians from all sorts of sectors. And there is clearly deep anxiety, even about talking about democracy. And what I want to say is that this is normal and this is healthy. And we have democracy is the least worse option for governance that comes from a place of respect for human dignity and for sustainable and resilient governance and social planning. So we know that in the business sector, especially in the competitive business sector around the world, democratic methods and practices have been adopted. Concepts of transparency, accountability, power sharing. These are all notions that have created innovation and success in the business sector. And so when we talk about democracy, we are essentially trying to find a way of ensuring that our sovereignty, our ways of sharing governance of ourselves, lead to success and resilience of the population. So that's how I would first respond to your question, is not to worry. Anxiety is a normal condition of democratic space.
It's part of the package, almost. I mean, the Anxieties of Democracy program was founded prior to the 2016 presidential elections, where there was a lot of concerns, a lot of talk about the role of democracy in a society. But the program was also there to address some of the fundamental challenges and to bring some of these issues to the surface. What would be interesting is, could those lessons that you learned, all that work and efforts that were put in, perhaps be applied to the Armenian context, the knowledge that was acquired during that program, to be applied and shared, perhaps with some Armenian colleagues and Armenian benefactors?
I think that this is the moment when, in the geopolitical situation, Armenia is isolated as a democracy in an authoritarian space, and that there are many lessons to be learned from the work that's still ongoing, in fact, that many of the researchers that we began with in 2015, we officially started. Those lessons are interesting and can be applied. But also what's extremely important, I think, is that we turn our attention to research on the Armenian context, that we have to understand that every democracy has its own context and its own political culture and its own forms of social practice and otherwise that are important to respect and understand in order for the form, which is a form of institutionalized power sharing and open and accountable and transparent government, can best take hold. So I would say, of course, there are lessons to learn. Several of them we worked very early on. In fact, one of our earliest working groups was a working group on climate change. Now, many people asked, what does climate change have to do with democracy? Well, climate change is a problem that's very hard to solve with existing incentives within democratic institutions. Temporal incentives, the election cycle doesn't lead people to think in the long term. Geographic incentives, it's very difficult to, within your district, to try and solve for something like climate change, which transcends a geography of a particular electoral district. So many of our team, our working group on climate change, was working on how is it that we can create policy and make those institutions work for problem solving in the long term. And these are depend on specific context, the specific democratic institutions, the specific legal infrastructure, and the specific social and geographic conditions. So we have lessons to learn, but we also, I think it will be interesting to learn from Armenian researchers and Armenian youth and Armenian civil society about what kind of democracy Armenia wants to create. And that's where the specific information should come from, as opposed to importing from the outside.
Right, but you spoke about the context. What a unique and extraordinary context and example Armenian democracy is. One could argue it started with a popular protest movement, revolution. It also has geopolitical context, obviously the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. Many people are looking forward to the September Yerevan municipal elections, how this will be a competitive election, and could see an opposition candidate win. Armenia has not had a democratic handover of powers since its independence. Those conversations, though, which you mentioned earlier, are they happening? Have they started to happen with Armenian researchers, with Armenian politicos here in the country?
So I've come to learn. I'm a new member of the Armenian Society of Fellows, and I came to begin the learning process. What I do know is that there is no formal research infrastructure interested in studying or mandated in a coordinated way yet to study democratic institutions and democratic culture in Armenia. And I think certainly that might be something that would be interesting to begin.
That's something you would like to see, I assume.
I think if there is a will for it, that it would be very interesting, and I would be happy to help support this work.
That's very interesting. And I'm also curious, the anxieties of democracies program. You mentioned it's not just about importing from other democracies around the world, but each specific democracy has its own particularities. That must be really understood in this context as well, if we are going to do what you just mentioned in the Armenia context. Wouldn't you agree?
I absolutely agree. I mean, the program that I had the privilege of working on a secondment from my university role as a professor was based mostly on the US. We had begun to do partnerships with the DFK and Germany, and because other spaces around the world had an interest in also thinking about challenges and stressors on democracies in their contexts as well. Of course, the world has a lot to learn about the US, but also the US has a lot to learn about the world. And I feel the same way about Canada, which is my home country. So I think, for example, in Canada, we have a lot to learn too about the practice of democracy in Armenia. We know in Canada that we have never had, for example, a trans member of parliament. This is something that Armenia succeeded in doing. This is a form of innovation. It's an indicator of many things. And so there are spaces of leadership in Armenia as well that we don't have in Canada, or the United States does not have as well. So I think that what democracy is not ever the fastest mode. It's a slow mode. But it's effective in the long run.
Because you go right back to French political thought in the 18th
that's right,
century.
In the 18th century, that's right.
And how it affected commerce, how it affected a whole swathe of spheres. So I mean, it is more abstract and complex than I think a lot of people understand. They think democracy, I guess, means perhaps just free and fair elections or something perhaps oversimplified. I want to also ask,
yes.
The Armenian Society of Fellows mission statement reads, "Our aim is to help raise Armenia's educational and research institutions to world-class levels and to network them globally." Very ambitious goal.
It certainly is.
But I'm wondering, when you saw that, what did you think? Did you think, is this overly ambitious? Okay, this is something I can get behind. What were your observations?
What attracted me when I was nominated to join the society was that there was a mix of diasporans and Armenians. What attracted me was that this was not an export model, that there was a framework of humility and of shared learning and of collaboration. So, and I think that that's, there's an extraordinary opportunity here. Armenia is a small country, but it has a highly educated population. I remember when I first visited in 2002, we saw that even though it was one of the coldest winters, that all of the children were still going to school and learning to read and write in 3 alphabets, in 3 different grammars. And that combined with a diasporan population that has its own history, but also a love of country, is a very interesting mix if we can see it as a dynamic, collaborative mission of shared understanding and shared knowledge and shared experience. No one has the answers alone, but I think this is a wonderful opportunity, and this is the path. A robust democracy needs a robust higher education and education system.
A prominent journalist once told me, if Armenia is saved, it will be because of civil society. And isn't education sector also part of that civil society? And this event, a bridge between the diaspora and Armenia. So, Anoush Fraser Terjanian, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining me.
Emilio, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.